Imagine a 74-year-old Vietnamese war veteran standing outside the Chinese embassy in Hanoi, voice hoarse from shouting patriotic slogans. Around him, crowds wave red flags and even set fire to factories they believe are Chinese-owned. "Our patience has limits," he exclaims. "We are ready to die to protect our nation." It's May 2014, and anti-China protests are erupting across Vietnam. The spark? A giant Chinese oil rig parked in contested waters off Vietnam's coast. On paper, this fury seems puzzling. Vietnam and China are both socialist republics led by communist parties. They once stood shoulder to shoulder as comrades in arms against foreign powers. Both nations fly the same red flag with a gold star, at least in spirit. So why would Vietnamese citizens direct such anger at a supposed ideological ally? Why does Vietnam, a fellow communist state, harbor some of the world's strongest anti-China sentiment? This is the paradox we explore today: how two countries sharing a common ideology ended up locked in distrust and rivalry. But how can two comrades be such wary neighbors? To answer that, we need to journey through a history of wars and ancient grievances, navigate heated maritime disputes, dissect fierce nationalism, scrutinize economic imbalances, and untangle differing visions of communism. Each of these layers sheds light on why shared Marxist-Leninist ideals haven't overcome deep-seated Vietnamese resentment toward China. Vietnam's skepticism of China runs deep, over 1,000 years deep. For over a millennium, starting in the 2nd century BC, Vietnamese lands were under the control of successive Chinese empires. Generations of Vietnamese grew up under what they call the Chinese yoke, a millennium of grievance that forged a profound sense of insecurity about their northern neighbor. In Vietnamese history, textbooks, schoolchildren still read about heroic resistance against invaders from the north. National legends celebrate warriors like the Trung sisters and Emperor Quang Trung who fought off Chinese armies. This ancient memory isn't just dusty lore. It's become a pillar of Vietnamese national identity. The lesson passed down is clear. Independence was hard-won against China, and vigilance must never lapse. Fast forward to the 20th century, and Vietnam and China's relationship took on new complexity. At mid-century, they suddenly found common cause: communism. During Vietnam's bloody struggle against French colonialism, and later against the United States, Communist China was an essential ally. Chairman Mao Zedong's China provided crucial aid, weapons, and sanctuary to Ho Chi Minh's Vietnamese revolutionaries fighting for independence. In those years, the slogan might as well have been "Comrades plus brothers." Shared ideology and shared enemies made Beijing and Hanoi feel like members of one socialist family. However, that fraternal phase was short-lived. After the Vietnam War ended in 1975, global communist unity began to crack. Vietnam leaned into the orbit of the Soviet Union, while China had fallen out with the Soviets in the Sino-Soviet split. By the late 1970s, the two communist neighbors were on opposite sides of a geopolitical rift. National interest trumped communist brotherhood. Hanoi forged a treaty with Moscow, and Beijing, resentful, edged closer to Washington. The ideological bedfellows became strange rivals. Tensions erupted into open conflict in 1979. In February of that year, a massive Chinese army launched a surprise invasion of Vietnam's northern border provinces. China's leader, Deng Xiaoping, pointedly said he wanted to teach Vietnam a lesson. The ensuing Sino-Vietnamese War of 1979 was brief, lasting less than a month, but brutal. Wave after wave of Chinese troops poured over the border in human wave assaults, and Vietnam's battle-hardened forces dug in ferociously. The result? A Pyrrhic victory claimed by both sides. Tens of thousands of soldiers died in those few weeks alone. In the first days of combat, some 4,000 Chinese troops were cut down almost immediately, and by war's end, Casualties on each side had soared into the tens of thousands. Cities and villages in Vietnam lay devastated. Neither side achieved any real strategic gain from the 1979 war, but the psychological damage was lasting. Imagine the shock for ordinary Vietnamese. Only a few years earlier, China had been Big Brother in the communist struggle. Now, Chinese tanks were rolling through their towns. The betrayal seared itself into Vietnam's collective memory. Beijing, for its part, has tried to all but erase this war from its official history books. Chinese state media rarely, if ever, mention the 1979 conflict, preferring the public to forget it ever happened. But in Vietnam, people have not forgotten. Families in the north still tend the graves of those killed by Chinese shells. Veterans still carry scars from that short, bloody war. It cemented the notion for many Vietnamese that even a shared communist ideology could not guarantee peace with China. Nor was 1979 the end of the fighting. Throughout the 1980s, sporadic border clashes continued between Vietnam and China. In 1988, another deadly encounter flared, this time at sea, in the remote Spratly Islands of the South China Sea. Chinese and Vietnamese naval forces clashed at Johnson's South Reef, exchanging fire over a speck of coral in the middle of ocean. Heavily outgunned, Vietnam's naval detachments were overwhelmed. 2 of their transport ships were sunk, and 64 Vietnamese sailors lost their lives in the battle. Harrowing footage from that incident, later circulated widely, even showed unarmed Vietnamese soldiers defiantly standing their ground on a reef as Chinese gunfire erupted. Once again, a communist comrade was pulling the trigger on Vietnamese troops. These modern conflicts layered fresh wounds atop ancient grievances. Each clash reinforced an ingrained narrative. Whenever China looms large, Vietnam must fight to stay free. The irony that both nations called themselves socialist didn't matter to the soldiers in the trenches or the sailors on sinking ships. As far as they were concerned, they were defending their homeland from an aggressive neighbor. Ideology be damned. It's worth noting that at the very moment the 1979 war erupted, Vietnam's ruling Communist Party was propagating ideals of proletarian solidarity and socialist fraternity. Yet here was a supposed socialist ally invading their soil. This was not lost on the Vietnamese public. To many, it proved that talk of brotherly friendship was hollow, and that national interest would always outweigh communist camaraderie. In the decades since, Vietnam and China normalized diplomatic relations in 1991, and even exchanged high-level party visits to mend fences. But the historical fault lines remain just beneath the surface, ready to crack open whenever tensions rise. As one analysis succinctly put it, China-Vietnam hostility has deep historical roots. It will not go away. This history sets the stage for the next major source of friction: territorial disputes that keep those old wounds fresh in the minds of both nations. If historical wars provided the kindling for anti-China sentiment, ongoing territorial disputes are the gasoline keeping the fire burning. At the heart of these disputes are 2 island chains in the South China Sea: the Paracel Islands, known as Hoang Sa in Vietnamese, and the Spratly Islands, Truong Sa in Vietnamese. Both Vietnam and China claim these islands, and the surrounding seas, as their sovereign territory. It's a high-stakes conflict over national pride, fishing waters, and potential undersea oil and gas. China's claim to almost the entire South China Sea is encapsulated in its infamous 9-dash line. This sweeping claim was first officially drawn by China in the late 1940s, and it encompasses nearly 90% of the South China Sea, reaching close to the shores of Vietnam and other Southeast Asian countries. Crucially, the 9-dash line loops around the Paracels and Spratlys, which Beijing insists are historically Chinese. From Hanoi's perspective, this is outright territorial encroachment, a theft of islands that have belonged to Vietnam for centuries. Vietnamese nationalists often point out that Vietnamese emperors have records of administering these islands, long before the People's Republic of China existed. The dispute isn't just lines on a map, it's been repeatedly fought over. Back in January 1974, when Vietnam was still divided into North and South, China seized the Paracel Islands from the then South Vietnamese government. A naval battle erupted. Chinese warships sank a South Vietnamese patrol vessel, and dozens of Vietnamese sailors were killed in the fighting. By the end of that clash, China had taken full control of the Paracels, a situation that persists today. At the time, North Vietnam, which was China's ally against the US, awkwardly stayed quiet or even tacitly acknowledged China's claim. But after Vietnam reunified, Hanoi reaffirmed that the Paracels and Spratlys are Vietnamese. It was an embarrassing thorn. The communist government had to eventually honor the South Vietnamese soldiers who died in 1974 as martyrs for the nation, despite having been their enemy in 1974. This episode shows how national territory trumps old divisions. Vietnam now considers the loss of the Paracels a national sacrifice, regardless of North-South politics. The Spratly Islands, scattered further south, saw that deadly 1988 skirmish we mentioned. To this day, both countries station troops on different bits of rock and reef. In recent years, China has dramatically upped the ante in the South China Sea. It has built artificial islands atop reefs, dredging sand to create military-grade runways and missile installations where once there was open sea. Chinese Coast Guard ships and naval militia now patrol these waters aggressively, chasing off fishing boats from Vietnam and other nations. From Hanoi's view, this is a direct challenge to its sovereignty. Every time a Chinese vessel ramrods a Vietnamese fishing boat or erects a new facility on a disputed reef, anti-China sentiment in Vietnam ticks up another notch. One major flashpoint was the 2014 oil rig incident briefly noted earlier. In May 2014, China parked a giant $1 billion oil drilling platform, the Haiyang Shiu 981, in waters near the Paracel Islands, waters that Vietnam also claims in its exclusive economic zone. It was as if a neighbor pitched a tent in your backyard and started drilling for oil. Vietnam reacted furiously. Vietnamese ships confronted the Chinese rig's flotilla, ramming Chinese vessels. China responded with water cannons. The standoff at sea lasted weeks. On land, Vietnam saw an unprecedented eruption of public anger. Protests swelled in multiple cities. Factories thought to be Chinese-owned were vandalized or set ablaze by rioters. In fact, some belonged to Taiwanese or Korean firms, an indication of how blind fury led to cases of mistaken identity. The government in Hanoi, which usually bans street demonstrations, surprisingly allowed these protests to vent, at least initially. That was telling. Even the authorities recognized how deeply the public resented China's move. As one Vietnamese protester declared to international media at the time, "We are here to express the will of the Vietnamese people to defend our territory at all costs." Clearly, the sense of territorial ownership and outrage at China's aggression ran from the highest levels of government to the man on the street. Such incidents continue to recur. Chinese survey ships probing for energy in contested waters have sparked confrontations with Vietnamese naval units. Chinese fishing bans, unilaterally imposed over large swathes of the sea, led Vietnam to encourage its fishermen to keep operating, sometimes at great personal risk. Deadly encounters have occurred. In 2020, for instance, a Vietnamese fishing boat sank after a clash with Chinese maritime forces, triggering diplomatic protests. Each event becomes a rallying point for Vietnamese social media users to voice indignation at China. From Vietnam's perspective, the pattern is clear. A larger China is bullying its smaller neighbor and nibbling away at Vietnam's maritime rights. And because these disputes involve national territory, always a hot-button issue, they stoke nationalism in its most visceral form. The fact that both countries are communist doesn't matter when Vietnamese see their flag being pulled down on an island and replaced with China's. As a Vietnamese naval officer once put it bluntly, "When it comes to our islands, we will never concede, not to France, not to the US, and not to China." That resolve is widely shared among the populace. It's important to note that Hanoi's communist leaders have a nuanced tightrope to walk here. On one hand, they publicly assert Vietnam's claims and quietly build up defenses. Vietnam has, for example, purchased advanced Russian submarines to counter Chinese naval power. On the other hand, they also engage in party-to-party diplomacy with Beijing and often urge citizens not to magnify the disputes. Too much popular anger could force the government into a corner, or worse, spark an armed conflict Vietnam wants to avoid. So the Vietnamese government has sometimes clamped down on anti-China rallies, fearing they could spin out of control or harm strategic relations. This balancing act, condemning China's actions but not letting public fury boil over, shows how delicate the issue is for Hanoi. Still, the very need for such balancing highlights how genuinely strong the anti-China undercurrent is among Vietnamese people. In short, territorial disputes in the South China Sea have become a potent fuel for anti-China sentiment. Every new map Beijing draws, every oil rig it plants, every island it fortifies, all these serve to validate Vietnam's historical wariness. And unlike historical events which might fade with time, these disputes are ongoing, fresh, and emotional. They keep the Vietnam-China relationship tense, despite the banner of socialist friendship both governments ritually invoke. Now, territorial pride and historical feuds are only part of the puzzle. Let's look at another powerful driver of Vietnamese public opinion, nationalism, and how it sometimes runs even stronger than communist ideology in shaping Vietnam's attitudes toward China. Vietnamese, we stand up against foreign aggressors. This could well be the subtitle of every Vietnamese history book. Nationalism in Vietnam is a proud, complex force, one that the ruling Communist Party itself has carefully cultivated and sometimes struggled to contain. When it comes to China, Vietnamese nationalism often takes on a distinctly anti-Chinese flavor, rooted in the historical and territorial issues we've already discussed. In the Vietnamese narrative, China frequently appears as the other, the giant to the north that Vietnam defines itself against. Take a walk in downtown Hanoi, and you might find a street vendor selling T-shirts with the slogan, "Nothing is more precious than independence and freedom," a famous quote of Ho Chi Minh. That wartime quote was aimed at American and French invaders, but it resonates just as strongly with memories of resisting China. Vietnam's school curriculum emphasizes the theme of resistance against foreign domination as a continuous thread from ancient times to the present. China is featured prominently as the first imperial foe in that story. Tales of how Vietnam was small but brave in pushing out Chinese overlords are celebrated as national epics. This narrative casts Vietnam almost as a perpetual David next to a looming Goliath. The line between patriotism and anti-China sentiment can blur, because loving the Vietnamese motherland often implicitly means standing guard against China. As one historian noted, the very identity of Vietnam as a nation has been defined by multiple struggles against China throughout history. To be clear, this doesn't mean Vietnamese people universally hate Chinese people on a personal level. Rather, it's a wariness of Chinese power and intentions. Even the language reflects it. An old Vietnamese proverb goes, "A near neighbor is better for trading from afar," hinting that too close entanglement with neighbors, like China, is to be handled carefully. Another famous saying, often, if crudely, cited, is attributed to Vietnam's first president Ho Chi Minh. "We would rather sniff French shit for 5 years than eat Chinese shit for 1,000. A stark reminder that Vietnamese leadership, even during colonial struggles, saw Chinese domination as a greater existential threat than Western colonization. Nationalism in Vietnam has thus been inextricably intertwined with skepticism of China. Interestingly, the Communist Party of Vietnam, VCP, has walked an ideological tightrope on nationalism. On one hand, the party rose to power as a nationalist force. It led the fight for independence from France and the US, claiming to represent the true will of the Vietnamese nation. VCP propaganda often glorifies the party as the heir of Vietnam's patriotic heroes. On the other hand, orthodox Marxist-Leninist theory actually frowns upon nationalism, branding it a bourgeois distraction from class struggle. Communism preaches international solidarity of the working class, transcending national boundaries. How did the Vietnamese communists square this circle? They effectively merged nationalism with communism in their doctrine. From early on, figures like Ho Chi Minh claimed that fighting for socialism was the ultimate way to secure Vietnam's independence. In other words, communism was portrayed as the path to true patriotism. The party taught that to be a good Vietnamese patriot, one must also be a good socialist. As a former prime minister famously put it, "To be patriotic is to build socialism." In this way, the VCP cast itself both as nationalist liberator and socialist vanguard. However, this formula is tested when the nation's antagonist is another socialist country, namely China. How can Vietnamese nationalism rail against China when Vietnam's ruling ideology calls for socialist brotherhood with China? This is a genuine dilemma. We saw it in the government's ambivalence about anti-China protests. The VCP sometimes suppresses overt anti-China nationalism, fearing it contradicts the party's line of socialist solidarity. In 2011, for example, when hundreds of Vietnamese took to Hanoi's streets to protest China's actions in the South China Sea, the authorities dispersed the demonstrations and detained some protesters. The protesters had been chanting against Chinese invasion of Vietnam's islands, a sentiment many ordinary Vietnamese shared. But from the party's perspective, encouraging too much nationalism that targets a fellow communist state could undermine their Marxist credentials. The party's message has often been, "We are nationalist, but not that kind of nationalist." This tight control can backfire. If people feel their leaders are too cozy with China or soft on Chinese infringements, it dents the party's nationalist legitimacy. The VCP has long claimed it, and only it can defend Vietnam's independence. So it faces a delicate balancing act, appearing patriotic and standing up to China just enough to satisfy the public, but not so much as to rupture ties with Beijing. In recent years, this has meant allowing some level of public discourse about historical conflicts with China. State media now occasionally commemorates events like the 1974 Paracels Battle or 1988 Spratly Clash, which it avoided mentioning for decades. It also means quietly beefing up Vietnam's military and diplomatic hedges against China. Yet at the same time, the official rhetoric between the two parties remains fraternal. References to the friendship between our peoples fostered by Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong, and so on. From the Vietnamese public's standpoint, there is often a cynical view. Beijing is big and bullying. Hanoi knows it needs to play nice publicly, but in private, everyone knows not to trust the Chinese. The average person in Vietnam might enjoy aspects of Chinese culture. Chinese movies, food, etc. are popular enough, and have no issue with individual Chinese people. But mention politics or sovereignty, and strong opinions flare up. "Never trust the Chinese government" is a common refrain, born from that long historical shadow. Nationalism in Vietnam means the country's hard-fought independence must be jealously guarded, especially from its most powerful neighbor. One striking manifestation of this is the Vietnamese diaspora and the anti-communist community. Many Vietnamese abroad are refugees from the Vietnam War era, virulently anti-communist. They are often even more anti-Beijing because they see the Hanoi regime as selling out to China. They accuse Vietnam's government of being a puppet or a coward if it ever appears to appease China. While this is a complex intra-Vietnamese political issue, it underscores that being anti-China is one of the few things that unites Vietnamese across political divides. Communists and anti-communists alike can agree on at least this much: keep China in check. National pride thus continuously injects energy into Vietnam's distrust of China. Even as leaders toast to camaraderie, the people remember ancient wars, recent battles, and a very current map where their country seems to shrink under China's shadow. The shared communist ideology is easily overshadowed by these nationalist memories and emotions. Now, nationalism is a matter of the heart, but there's also a hard-nosed practical side to Vietnam's grievances with China. That lies in the economic realm, where benefits and dependencies intermingle in a way that causes both hope and heartburn in Vietnam. Let's examine how economics play into this paradoxical relationship. Walk through any Vietnamese market and start checking labels. Chances are you'll find "Made in China" on a vast array of goods, from electronics to clothing to kids' toys. China's economic footprint in Vietnam is enormous. It's a double-edged sword. On one hand, China is Vietnam's largest trading partner and a key investor, bringing in affordable goods and capital. On the other hand, many Vietnamese worry that their economy is becoming too dependent on their giant neighbor, tilting the balance of power and hurting local industries. Economic ties have thus become another source of resentment, feeding the narrative that China benefits at Vietnam's expense. The raw numbers tell part of the story. In 2022, China was Vietnam's #1 trading partner by far, with two-way trade between the two countries reaching about $175.5 billion. By comparison, Vietnam's trade with its second-largest partner, the United States, was much lower, around $124 billion. This means roughly a quarter of Vietnam's entire foreign trade is with China alone. On the surface, that sounds like a mutually beneficial bonanza, and indeed, trade has skyrocketed over the past decade as the two economies become more intertwined. Vietnamese businesses export billions in goods to the huge Chinese market, from agricultural produce like dragon fruit and coffee to electronics components for China's factories. One Vietnamese coffee company boasts that 1 in every 18 cups of coffee sold in China is made from Vietnamese beans. Chinese demand has also fueled booms for Vietnamese farmers. For example, within a year of China opening its market to Vietnamese durian fruit, durian exports surged by nearly 50%, hitting over $1.2 billion. Yet, if you scratch deeper, the balance of this economic relationship is very unequal. Vietnam consistently runs a massive trade deficit with China. In 2022, Vietnam bought about $60 billion more in goods from China than it sold to China. Chinese products flood Vietnam's consumer markets and serve as critical inputs for Vietnam's manufacturing sector. Everything from machinery, chemicals, fabrics, to plastics come in from China. Many Vietnamese factories basically assemble goods for export using raw materials or components imported from China. This creates a dependence that can feel uncomfortable. If China were to cut off supplies, some Vietnamese industries might grind to a halt. In essence, China enjoys the position of an economic lifeline, a fact not lost on Vietnamese policymakers and citizens alike. Economic grievances surface in multiple ways. Local producers often complain that cheap Chinese imports undercut Vietnamese-made products. For example, Vietnamese farmers have sometimes had to dump their harvests when sudden gluts of Chinese produce, legal or smuggled, hit the market at lower prices. Small businesses grumble that Chinese suppliers have the upper hand in pricing and can squeeze them. The communist ideology of shared prosperity doesn't offer much comfort here. Business is business, and Vietnam clearly feels like the junior partner. So far, we've looked at history, territory, nationalism, and economics, all earthly issues that would strain any bilateral relationship. But there's also a more theoretical facet to this paradox: ideology itself. How do Vietnam and China's interpretations of communism differ? And has that contributed to distrust? Let's delve into that intellectual and political realm next. On the surface, Vietnam and China both swear by Marxism-Leninism and socialist ideology. They are two of the only 5 remaining communist-ruled countries in the world, alongside Cuba, Laos, and North Korea. Both countries' ruling parties regularly hold high-level meetings affirming their shared ideals and socialist brotherhood. So ideologically, they should be the best of friends. That's the theory. The reality, however, is more complicated. Differing interpretations of Marxist-Leninist principles and diverging political paths have at times made the two parties wary of each other, rather than trusting allies. First, there's the historical split we discussed, the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s. Vietnam essentially chose the Soviet side in that ideological feud, while China championed its own brand of communism, Maoism, against what it saw as a revisionist Soviet Union. This led to mutual suspicion. Beijing came to view Vietnam's party as too aligned with Moscow, and thus not fully trustworthy. In turn, Vietnamese communists viewed China's 1970s dalliance with the West and support for Cambodia's Khmer Rouge as a betrayal of socialist solidarity. In simple terms, the supposed communist brotherhood fell apart in the Cold War's latter half, a fratricidal spat that culminated in that 1979 war. From an ideological perspective, each side accused the other of deviating from true socialism. China painted Vietnam as a pawn of Soviet imperialism, and Vietnam saw China as behaving like a great power chauvinist rather than a true internationalist. While the Cold War is over, echoes of those differing alignments linger. Older Vietnamese officials who lived through that era haven't entirely forgotten being called Cuba in Asia, a jibe implying Vietnam was the Soviets' tropical sidekick against China. And Chinese hardliners surely remember when Vietnam condemned China's actions in Cambodia and aligned with Soviet troops right on China's border. These historical grievances had an ideological tint. Trust was broken at the party-to-party level, not just nation-to-nation. Then came the era of reforms. China in the 1980s under Deng Xiaoping pioneered socialism with Chinese characteristics, essentially embracing market economics while keeping one-party rule. Vietnam, a few years later in 1986, launched its own economic reforms called Choi Moi, renovation, also moving toward a socialist-oriented market economy. Superficially, their economic ideologies became more similar again, both mixing communism with capitalism. But here's an interesting nuance. Some Vietnamese communist thinkers harbored concerns about China's influence on their ideological line. Vietnam has jealously guarded its political independence, even within the communist world. It never wanted to be seen as a vassal to China's Communist Party. In fact, after normalization of ties in the 1990s, Hanoi and Beijing set up regular party consultation meetings. They share notes on party building, propaganda, Marxist theory training, etc. However, Vietnamese officials are careful to take Chinese advice with a grain of salt. Ideology mattered less and less in the foreign affairs of both Vietnam and China, notes one analysis of the post-Cold War period. In other words, even as they talk about theory, what drives each country is national interest. Vietnam's leaders realize that Beijing's foreign policy is guided by China's national interests, not by any sentimental communist fraternity. As one Vietnamese analyst put it, some old guard in Hanoi may preach socialist solidarity, but the more pragmatic cadres see that rhetoric as largely a facade. There's also the issue of which model of communism to follow. In the 2010s and 2020s, China's Communist Party under Xi Jinping became more authoritarian and began flexing its muscles abroad. Vietnam's Communist Party watched warily. They benefited from China's economic rise, yes, but they also saw potential risks in China's model. For instance, China's heavy-handed approach to dissent, think Tiananmen in 1989, or more recently the crackdown in Hong Kong, is something Vietnamese leaders study, sometimes to emulate control techniques, but also as a lesson in what not to stir up among their own populace. Vietnam's regime, while certainly repressive of opposition, often operates with a bit more concern for not igniting mass unrest, partly because they've seen anti-China sentiment spark protests that could turn anti-regime if mismanaged. Some Vietnamese intellectuals argue that Vietnam's communism has a stronger nationalist flavor, less concerned with global communist revolution, more with preserving Vietnamese sovereignty and unique identity. China's communism, by contrast, is entwined with a sense of Chinese greatness and centrality. These differing flavors can lead to subtle distrust. Vietnamese cadres might quietly fear that fraternal help from China could morph into domination, as has happened in centuries past, albeit under different flags. One ideological sticking point often cited is how each country views the principle of internationalism versus nationalism. The Vietnamese party officially espouses proletarian internationalism, solidarity among socialist states. This is one reason the party leadership has been uncomfortable with too much anti-China fervor. It contradicts the ideal that socialist countries should stand together. However, critics argue that Vietnam's communists selectively apply this. They'll be internationalist when it suits, e.g., supporting China in some global issue, but nationalist when core interests are at stake, the South China Sea, for example. China likely sees through this inconsistency. Similarly, China calls for socialist solidarity, yet it pressures Vietnam on territorial and economic fronts, an inconsistency not lost on the Vietnamese. Each side perhaps views the other as communist in name, opportunist in practice. Despite all this, it's important to note that publicly, the two communist parties maintain a facade of ideological harmony. High-level visits are choreographed with language about comrades plus brothers, shared destiny, and learning from each other's party work. In 2024, for instance, when a new Vietnamese party general secretary made Beijing his first foreign visit, state media from both countries gushed about how the strategic trust between the two parties would be strengthened and how they shared the same political system and ideals. Such warm words are intended to reassure both populations that despite quarrels, the leaderships are aligned. And indeed, Vietnam has not deviated from one-party rule or moved into any Western democratic orbit, something that surely comforts China. In international forums, Vietnam often avoids openly criticizing China and sometimes even supports China's positions, or at least stays neutral, part of that communist camaraderie. However, behind closed doors, Hanoi hedges. It maintains active defense ties with powers like Russia, India, and yes, even the United States now as counters to over-reliance on China. It pushes quietly for ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, unity on the South China Sea Code of Conduct to constrain China. And ideologically, Vietnam ensures it isn't wholly intellectually dependent on Beijing. For example, Vietnamese think tanks and party schools still draw on a variety of socialist thought, including old Soviet and newer Western economic ideas, rather than just mimicking whatever line comes out of Beijing. In summary, the ideological paradox is that Vietnam and China are officially the closest of ideological allies, yet in practice they treat each other with a notable lack of ideological trust. They cooperate as fellow socialist states where convenient, but both suspect the other will abandon socialist principles if it suits national interest. Marx famously said, "Proletarians have no fatherland," but in the case of Vietnam and China, each communist party very much has a fatherland to prioritize, and that makes for a careful, sometimes cynical partnership rather than a genuine meeting of minds.